We all know that one student that just won't budge. They refuse to follow instructions, they challenge authority, and they are resistant to the typical consequences. So, how can we reach out to them without losing control of our classroom? That's the topic on today's episode of Classroom Coffee Break. I'm John Van Dusen, a long term teacher, coach, and Army officer. And in this episode, we're talking about how to deal with behavior management for that one or two really stubborn students. So first, let's just acknowledge that that's human nature. Some of us are more stubborn than others. Some of us naturally resist authority more than others. However, as a teacher, you might have 30 students in your room, so you cannot let one or two students completely derail your entire lesson, your entire classroom, your entire plan for the day. So let's get into this. First, let's talk about why students act out. So some of it might be a lack of control either in their personal life, or they feel like they have no control in what happens in the classroom, which you're the teacher, they're the student. They need to have some form of followership because that's the dynamic that we have established. They may have some difficulty regulating emotions. You're going to see this a lot more with younger grades. But even as we get into higher grades, you're going to have students that are dealing with all different types of emotions, all different types of hormones going through puberty, and they just might not have the tools to properly regulate their emotions. Another reason students might act out is their desire for attention or autonomy. Sometimes you'll have students that even bad attention is good for them. They just want attention. And then the last reason I'll talk about is frustration with the academic content. So you may have a student who is really struggling. You see this a lot, I think, in math, where there's a lot of higher level critical thinking skills, but also in my course of history, if you miss a couple key blocks of what has happened, when we get to the next part of history that was shaped by the first part that you missed, you may feel a lot of frustration because you don't understand why these certain events are even happening. So I think the key point with this and why students act out is behavior is communication, and understanding the why behind that behavior is going to be the first step in managing it correctly. And I think depending on the age, your topic, and how long you are with that student throughout the day is going to make a huge impact on if you're even going to be able to figure out the why. And the reason I say that is if you're an elementary teacher and you have this student for, let's say, 6 hours out of the day, you're going to have a lot better chance of figuring out the why and why they're acting out. Is it because they don't have any control in their personal life? Is it because they can't regulate their emotions? Is it because they're frustrated with the content, or they desire that attention? You're going to be able to figure that out a lot quicker than, say, a middle school or high school teacher that only sees that student for 45 minutes a day. And I go back to when I was a STEM teacher, and I had a real struggle with that because I would see those students once a week. And if we had a snow day or if there was an assembly, I might go 2 or 3 weeks without seeing certain students. So if they were acting out in my room, I had about 3 seconds to try to figure out the why before I had to deal with it and get the rest of the class moving. Because again, those other 25 students only saw me once a week, and it wasn't fair to them to completely derail their STEM class for the behavior issues of one. So let's talk about 3 types of stubborn students. So the first one is defiant, and this is the student that challenges your authority openly. And this is maybe the toughest for me personally to deal with. And I think that goes back to my Army background because we all wear our authority on our chest. When you walk into a room, you immediately know who's the highest ranking, who's in charge, who gets the respect just based on their rank. So when I walk into a classroom as a lieutenant colonel in the Army and I have someone just flat out tell me no, that doesn't sit well with me. And because I know that I have to make sure I put my Army hat down and put on my teacher hat and deal with that student accordingly. Because again, behavior is just communication, and I have to try to figure out the why and why that student is being openly defiant. So the second type of student we'll talk about today is the passive aggressive student. And this is the one that resists quietly. You might not even notice that they're not doing their work. You might not even notice that they're making jokes behind your back, but this could be the most disrespectful because they know they're being disrespectful, but they're doing it in a way that they don't get in trouble. most of the time. So I use a lot of humor and a lot of sarcasm in my classroom. So sometimes that backfires on me with the passive aggressive student. And sometimes we need to go out in the hallway and have a conversation about what is appropriate for school, what types of jokes, what type of passive aggressiveness is applicable and appropriate in an eighth grade classroom, especially when it goes from student to teacher, but also I need to make sure myself is in check when we go from teacher to student using sarcasm, humor, and jokes. And just as a side note, I have gone too far with those jokes. And I think the most important thing you can do as a teacher is to apologize, because now you're modeling that, yes, I acknowledge I made a mistake. I feel bad for it. And I'm asking for your forgiveness so that we can repair this relationship. But this passive aggressive student is the one that's going to have their book open. Their notebook's going to be open. You're going to walk over there to check on them, and they're going to be drawing a picture. You're going to check the missing assignments, and they're going to have 4 out of the 5 assignments are missing because they just don't feel like doing it, but they made you feel like they were doing the work while they're in their class. Now, the last type I'm going to take the other way, and this is the anxious student. And this is the student who may be stubborn because of their fear of failure or their fear of change. This might be the student that will do one question and then be at your desk asking if it's okay. They might draw one part of the assignment that you're asking for, and then they're asking, is this okay? They may be so worried about failing that they actually sabotage their own success. And I did an episode on Prepare to Fail, which I'll link down in the show notes, which actually talks about the idea of failing for students and how some students just cannot take the failure. I gave a quiz last week that had 20 questions on it, and I had a student that got a 19 out of 20. Devastated, completely devastated with her grade of a 19 out of 20. So again, that anxious student isn't going to be a behavior issue in that they're going to cause a disruption. There are going to be a behavior issue in that they may be sabotaging their own success because they're so worried about getting something wrong, about failing, about disappointing you, themselves, or their family. So I'm going to go over 5 different strategies that you can use for managing stubborn behavior. And the first one is going to be build that relationship first. The first couple weeks of school has to be strictly on building those relationships. And the old saying of nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care, that is 1,000% true when it comes to students, when it comes to players. If you're coaching a team, it is by far the number one important thing that you can do is build some type of relationship with that student. So some of the best ways you can do that is having informal conversations that have nothing to do with school. If you notice they're wearing a Green Bay Gamblers sweatshirt, talk to them. Hey, have you been to a Gamblers game? What do you think about this? How do you feel about that? If you see them drawing in their notebook, make sure you go up and comment on it and say, oh, wow, can you explain that picture to me? That's really neat. I have so many talented 8th graders when it comes to drawing, when it comes to music, when it comes to sports, that it is just amazing. And if you can actually just have a conversation with them that has nothing to do with your class, it's going to help build that relationship. And the reason it works is students are way more likely to cooperate with someone they feel respects them, understands them, has something in common with them, than some just sage on the stage who's up there telling me about, I don't know, Thomas Jefferson. Who cares? So the second way of dealing with stubborn behavior is offer choices and autonomy. So if you can give students some control over their learning environment, they're going to be a lot more willing to follow your directions. So an example would be, would you like to work on this assignment at your desk? Would you want to go down in the hall? Would you like to go down in the library? Another example of giving some kind of choice or autonomy is having 2 different methods of completing the assignment. So maybe one of them is copying and answering the questions out of the book. Maybe another one is creating 10 flashcards so that we can help study for our quiz. If you can somehow give that student a choice, they're going to be way more likely to do what they chose to do than what you told them they had to do. And I talked about this in the last episode too, of even giving them the illusion of choice, where maybe you give them 2 or 3 choices, but one choice is obviously so much better than the other ones that that's the one they're going to pick. As an example of this, when we were studying the Trail of Tears, I told the students we could either sit and take notes or we could sit and watch this video that I had for them. And the video, although it was a little longer, did a really great job. And I told them we can either sit and take notes or we can watch the video and have a conversation. Well, obviously they chose the video instead of sitting and taking notes. So even though they did have a choice, I kind of knew which choice they were automatically going to take. And the reason this works is offering choices helps students feel empowered, and it's going to automatically take down those walls that create resistance. So the third method of managing stubborn behavior is using logical consequences. So ensure that the consequences are directly related to the behavior. So I use the term not with my students, but in my own head of kind of the punishment has to fit the crime. So if somebody brings in a bag of Doritos and they get smashed all over the floor and there's a big mess, what does that student have to do? They need to go to the janitor's closet, get the vacuum, and come clean up the mess. So I've seen this happen with Chromebooks as well, where if a student gets frustrated and bangs on their Chromebook, okay, you don't get to use the Chromebook anymore. You have to do this assignment with paper and pencil. And by using logical consequences, it's very apparent to the student why they have to do something a certain way. And it's not just some arbitrary rule that you made up. Well, you have to do it this way because of this certain thing you did over here. Another example, we had some students that were throwing grapes at the janitor in the lunchroom. Come on now, throwing grapes. But their consequence, and this was school-wide, this wasn't on me, but they had to work with that janitor to help clean up after lunch for a few days. And I'll tell you what, it went back to that first part and it built that relationship. They didn't know the janitor. That's why it was so easy to pick on him. Once they understood him, it was a whole new ball game at lunch. They knew the janitor, they had worked with the janitor. Not only were they not throwing grapes at him anymore, but they were getting other students around them to help clean up. So the reason why it works is logical consequences feel fair and help students connect their actions to the consequences. So the fourth way to deal with managing stubborn behavior is to reinforce the positive behaviors that you acknowledge. If you go back to the first part, we said, why is a student acting up in the first place? Maybe they want attention. Well, if they do something positive, give them that attention. If you catch a student doing the right thing, acknowledge them. And here you need to read the room, because if it's a tough guy, middle school boy, you may not want to do that acknowledgement in the front of the class. You may want to pull him out in the hall and say, hey, I saw that you helped little Jimmy with his books after he dumped them all over the floor. And I'm really proud of you for doing that. Thank you for being a good friend. Thank you for growing into a nice young man. I had a student who's really struggling. He would fall into that passive aggressive behavior, but he got an 18 out of 20 on that quiz I just mentioned earlier. So I pulled him up to the computer and I showed him, I said, hey, this is a really great job. Congratulations. I can tell you worked really hard on this. And you could see that he didn't want to smile because he's a middle school tough guy, but he couldn't help it. He had a little pride in the work that he had done. And the fact that that was acknowledged really meant a lot to him. And again, that would not have worked if I hadn't first built that relationship with him. So the reason it works is positive reinforcement encourages students to repeat those desired behaviors and stay away from those undesired behaviors. The fifth method of managing stubborn behavior is actually going to tie all of the other ones together, and that is to remain calm and consistent. I mentioned in my podcast several times that we are the adult in the room. We have that fully functional frontal lobe. We can use logic in our decision making. We are not stuck in the caveman brain all the time. So we really need to take advantage of that. And don't engage in power struggles with a student, because they'll always find a way to manipulate what you said and win. Remain calm, neutral tone, and stick to your established rules and consequences. If they do something that has earned a consequence, they earn the consequence. A great example of this was when I was student teaching in Gwyn. The principal had a handbook sitting on the desk, and if a student came into the office, she would hand them the handbook and say, tell me what you did. And they would look up in the handbook, see what they had done, what infraction they incurred, and what the consequence was. That way, it was not the principal versus the student. It was the behavior versus the consequence. And if you've listened to Classroom Coffee Break, I've mentioned that before. But if you can detach those emotions by staying calm and consistent, you're going to have a much better interaction with that stubborn student. And the reason it works is emotional reactions can escalate a situation, and consistency builds trust and predictability. All right, so what do we do when nothing is working? We understand why a student is acting out. We've tried the different techniques, so that's not working. Now what? First off, I'm going to encourage you that you involve the parents and guardians early, because if there's a behavior happening at school that is inappropriate, it's probably happening at home as well. So if you can work with the parents to help curb that behavior and help be consistent between home and school, you're going to have a much better time. And also, that open communication with parents, understanding the student's background and maybe what strategies they're using at home to help that student, is all going to be a win-win, not just for you in managing your classroom, but for that student as well. Because you remember, you're dealing with kids, and some of those kids just have a tough time growing up. So if you're struggling with a student and it's getting to the point where it's an everyday thing, involve those parents really, really early. The second thing you can do when nothing is working is really involve your colleagues and your admin. If you're at a middle school or high school level, you have other teachers that are also working with that student. Get with them, see if they're doing anything that is working, see if they've tried something that hasn't worked, so that you can collaborate together and help make that student successful. And if it gets to the point where you can't handle it as a teaching team, you always have that administrative backup, either your principal or assistant principal. Get them involved, especially if it's a middle school or high school environment. They've seen that student in previous grades, and they can maybe give you some insight into their background, some insight into other things that have worked. And just remember that it is a team effort, and we are all on the same team. We're all pulling the rope in the same direction. We're all peeling the same onion. We're all grinding the same sausage. Our job is to help make those students successful. And the third thing I would say that you can do if nothing is working is really reflect on yourself, reflect on your own approach. Am I doing what I need to do to help this student? And maybe you are, but ask yourself and look in the mirror. Are you being fair? Are you being consistent? Have you built that relationship? And sometimes just taking a step back and reflecting on your own approach might be enough for you to adjust your technique a little bit and help move the ball forward. So to finish up here, I'd say that managing stubborn behavior can be challenging, but it's important to remember that every student has the potential to grow and change, and it's our job as educators to push them forward in their journey of growth. Building relationships, staying consistent, and using logical consequences are going to be key to this. And when in doubt, lean on your colleagues and keep reflecting on your practice. Contact the parents, get the admin involved. You are all on the same team. So thanks for joining me for this episode of Classroom Coffee Break. If you found this episode helpful, subscribe and share it with a fellow teacher. And remember, teaching is all about growth for both you, but especially for your students. Until next time, keep growing, keep learning, and keep making a difference.